Protesters in Detroit blocking buses from taking kids to summer school. They say the city's classrooms are not safe for students or teachers with coronavirus cases in Michigan on the rise. NBC News correspondent Heidi Prisbilla is in Detroit. And Heidi, what are teachers and parents there telling you?
Hi, Allison. I'm outside Priest Elementary School on Detroit's west side. This is one of 23 schools that are now in session for summer school. That is unusual. It is unusual for Michigan, and it's unusual for all around the country. You talk to parents and educators on the one hand who are very concerned about the safety protocols that they view here as essentially experimental on their children, knowing that a lot of these buildings have poor ventilation systems, poor infrastructure. On the other hand, you have administrators and other parents who say that they really have no option because of those infrastructure shortfalls, because of the fact that a lot of these students are impoverished, Allison. And when they went out in March, due to COVID, they stayed out. They didn't have Chromebooks. They didn't have Wi-Fi to do their virtual learning. And yet they're being held to the same standards as other children who did have those resources. Take a listen to one of the protesters out there today about what she had to say about the concerns about children in these schools.
We know from bus drivers, teachers, parents, that the schools are not safe. They are not following the guidelines that they even set for themselves. But even if they were, it would not be safe to send kids back into these schools. The CDC has said that the fastest way to spread the virus is reopening the schools, and they're only opening them in Detroit, in this whole area, just Detroit. And that's because Detroit is being used, Detroit kids are being used as guinea pigs for reopening the economy.
So, Allison, a lot of concerns there from parents who do feel like their children are being used as one big experiment. There's been some harsh words used about this by protesters and by parents who say that there has got to be some way, if we can figure out how to funnel money out to companies, out to millionaires and billionaires who've been getting PPP loans, that we can't figure out some kind of way to virtually treat our poorest and neediest kids.
Heidi, what is the school district doing to protect students and teachers there?
I had a long talk yesterday with the president of the school board who said, look, we are taking every precaution. We had a 60-page plan which outlines all of these safety protocols, which include testing for all teachers. They can't come back until they are all tested, social distancing, masks, disinfectant. But at the same time, I talk to concerned parents who say the children aren't being tested. How do they know if they have an outbreak, if an asymptomatic child comes in, which we know is a common thing, and creates an outbreak, especially considering all of the testing delays that we are seeing with folks here not being able to get their tests back for 5 to 7 days. Some people say that's a big problem. The school board told me it's not, but at the same time, even on the first day, yesterday, that they were trying to get this plan off the ground, they had protests outside the bus terminals trying to block these children from getting on the buses and going to school. You had 2 bus drivers at least who quit because they said there were not adequate safety protocols, including hand sanitizer. And I also spoke with a teacher who said that because one of the teacher's tests failed to come back, they had to double up classrooms. Now, because so many of the students were blocked, that did not pose a problem of overcrowding on that particular day, Allison.
Heidi, how about the upcoming school year? I mean, this is just summer school. They've got the full school year ahead, and that isn't all that far off.
It is not. And the administrators here in Detroit who I talked to said that they are very concerned about what that will look like in the fall, that no decisions have been made, that this is very different from what will happen in the fall when you have 53,000 students in this school system here coming back to these overcrowded schools that have poor infrastructure. That what they're doing now is something that they can do in the interim. They can do social distancing. They can have these safety protocols now. That doesn't mean that they can do it in the fall. So they're very much waiting on the governor to come up with a plan. The governor said you got to have 3 options for all schools. Detroit City Public Schools especially could be at risk given the overcrowding and also the poverty here. Now, some of these students have just now getting their Chromebooks, but think about it. A number of them don't have Wi-Fi, or they don't have the resources to have the parents at home helping them. Their parents are on the front lines of COVID. They're service providers. They're nurses. We already had a young child here. It was a high-profile case, die of COVID, a 5-year-old. So while the argument is that children largely are being spared, children are dying too. And we know that buildings like restaurants with poor ventilation are one of the main ways that COVID is spread. And even if it doesn't hurt these children, they're at risk of bringing it home to their family members who may have comorbidities and other healthcare issues. Allison.
So many serious concerns there, even though, as you said, it looks like children are at lower risk. Children are still dying from the coronavirus in our country. Heidi, thank you so much.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.